Steel isn't strong, boy. Flesh is stronger. Look around you. That is power. The strength and power of flesh. What is steel compared to the hand that wields it? Contemplate this on the tree of woe.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everyone's doing well. We've got what was originally a bite-sized video and is now like a 30-something minute video, where we talk about one of the more mysterious aspects of Elden Ring's lore. That's right, as the thumbnail or the title probably implied. Today we're going to be talking about serpents and their overall significance and most of the known lore about them. Specifically in Elden Ring. I know that Dark Souls had the famous world serpents, who I also want to do a video about. In Dark Souls 1, the man-serpents made up the bulk of the garrison that manned Sen's Fortress, a booby-trap-filled fort that was designed to test cursed undead to see if they were worthy of serving the gods. And some of the other man-serpents served Seath the Scaleless in his lab research in a similar way to how the man-serpents in this game serve Rykard. And it was generally believed that these scaly bros were the descendants of the ancient dragons, basically what was left of them. And although I tend to take that to be more spiritually than literally, by the time of Dark Souls 3, man-serpents are the ones who are acting as the janitory force of Archdragon Peak, serving the very last of the dragons and the half-dragon, half-human hybrids that had followed the path of the dragon. Some pretty exalted work for a bunch of dudes covered in rags. But I think this connection to the dragons exists in some form in Elden Ring as well, but instead of their connection being to the actual dragons, they appear to have some connection to the Dragon Communion cult as well as the magma worms, but we'll get into that as we ramble on into this video. Anyway though, like I said, we're just going to stick to Elden Ring serpents, because if not, I'll end up talking about those giant snake tumbleweeds from Bloodborne or something. But I figured now was as good a time as any to talk about him, since that new trailer for the DLC featured one that I think is made out of blood quite heavily. And sure, it might just be a red snake, it might not be made out of blood at all, but wouldn't it be cool if it was? And it's not like there isn't a connection between the Formless Mother and the serpents already, so it definitely seems like there's a precedent for it, especially when we hear of stuff called the Formless Serpents, which we'll get into. But anyway, brass tacks. So in the greater lexicon of the fantasy genre as a whole, snakes are often depicted as manipulative, sinister entities or spirits. Occasionally you might find a giant snake that is an ally to the main character of a story, although those examples seem to be quite rare. Generally in most fiction, snakes are used to portray temptation of dark forces or evil spirits as a whole. Basically, temptation of evil personified. And the Greater Will and Golden Order's stance on serpents seems to be no different, although they have taken it a step further. They've made snakes into effectively an egregore for everything the Greater Will is in opposition of, everything that's considered blasphemous by the Golden Order. They view fire in a similar way, but that's understandable. I mean, their god is represented by a tree, of course they're going to be scared of fire that could burn it. No, their stance on snakes seems almost personal. Perhaps there was some Empyrean who chose to associate himself with snakes, and it sort of left a lasting impact on the Greater Will or its servants. As far as I know, it's not currently known exactly why. All that's known is the snake is effectively an effigy for all things the Erd Tree found blasphemous. So first and foremost, snakes are viewed as traitors to the Erd Tree and are associated with things that are deemed blasphemous. This ends up also being why the gladiator helmets in the old Colosseums were adorned with snake effigies, as the crowds took delight in seeing the snakes get battered beyond recognition. They wore this armor coil that was in the design of a snake, and the really good showmen adorned their helmets with several bronze snakes and even wore this coil shield that was capable of poisoning their enemies. Some of these warriors even developed their own fighting styles based on these new serpent-themed weapons like the serpent stinger fists, an underrated weapon if I may add. Those gladiators got really inventive with the concept. They likely played a sort of villainous role in the warrior games, presumably taunting the crowd and mocking the Erd Tree, all adding to the grand spectacle that was once the Colosseum fights, but that was all before Radagon cancelled everything. It's anyone's guess why Radagon would do such a thing, because the games were quite popular, but perhaps he also had a thing for serpents, but that's a heavy speculation. but it isn't really known why the greater will wants the snake to be viewed as this symbol of traitorousness and villainy. Although perhaps we will find out in this DLC, and perhaps maybe we might even find out Radagon's connection with a certain serpent-aligned demigod that we saw in the trailer. Perhaps all that snake imagery reminded Radagon of a forgotten son of his. It's currently one of Elden Ring's greater mysteries as to why the snake is viewed this way. Maybe the snakes, or at least the god-devouring one, is just from a previous order, perhaps during the Crucible, as there are a few statues that depict either Iglay or just serpents in general as having wings, talons, and feathers, along with their own, normal serpentine look. Almost reminds me of the Snagrit from Pikmin, but just a little bit more Dark Soulsian. So maybe it's just something that simple. Maybe since it reminds the Golden Order and the Greater Will of the Crucible, that it should be turned into this lightning rod of hate for all of the Erdtree's faithful. Or maybe it's something more personal than that. Maybe it's because it ate some as of yet unnamed god, and the Greater Will recognizes the threat that the serpent possesses, so it just wants to keep it, well, for lack of a better word, suppressed. Or maybe it's because of something this Mesmer character did. Hopefully we'll get to find out, but anyway, its status as this symbol of everything that the Erdtree is opposed to has been adopted by anarchists like the depraved perfumers, former battle commanders who started imbibing their own perfumes and eventually went mad or just saw the futility in serving the Erdtree. So to show the world how they really feel, these perfumers adorn their little perfuming aprons with a unique design of a snake ensnaring the Erdtree, constricting it, if you will. The Erdtree is also depicted as being burnt on their aprons, presumably to show their hatred of the Golden Order. It's also worth mentioning that the serpent they have depicted on their garb greatly resembles the serpent that we saw in the trailer, wielded by that Mesmer character. Now, I'm not saying these guys are loyal to him, but I think they're, appropriating his imagery to state their intent for blasphemy. And once again, the serpent is depicted in red, which further makes me believe that that serpent in the trailer was made of blood, but again, we will have to wait and see on that one. Now, back to the perfumers. These guys participate in all kinds of blasphemous activities, such as hunting the living jars for alchemy materials, helping a serial-killing warrior monk stage a prison riot, and taking over the Shaded Castle. The depraved perfumers are actually kind of cool. I mean, a lot cooler than these gladiators whose job was essentially to get their heads bashed in by mad pumpkin warriors. It wasn't all bad though. Some were given jobs as grave tenders, and a lot of the pumpkin heads found work as mercenaries. But anyway though, when people generally think of snakes in Elden Ring, the first thing that usually comes to their mind is a certain demigod named Rykard. And he was definitely an interesting individual. Demigod and member of a certain serpent cult that liked to recruit strong warriors to its cause, he's effectively Elden Ring's very own Thulsa Doom. Currently, he lives for Blasphemy, but originally, he was the son of Radagon and Renala, and he traveled the world experiencing all these different foreign cultures, even at one point bringing a dancer back with him who would eventually become his successor in many ways. But being the worldly fellow that he was, he questioned the Golden Order and the greater will of the Erdtree, and eventually actively opposed it. And his going against the grain resulted in one of the bloodiest battles ever fought in the Lands Between, one that's still sitting at a stalemate even as its mindless soldiers are still duking it out with one another and the frenzied ones are devouring the corpses of the dead. It's basically just a fucking mess up there, and all of the horrors that were committed on Malgelmir during this war are effectively blamed on Rykard, simply for going against the gods. It should be noted that all of his knights and followers were loyal to him right up until he fed himself to the serpent, after which point he would need to gain new followers, which is why he founded Volcano Manor and started having the Tarnished hunt down and kill other Tarnished, as a way of ensuring that no one will be the new Elden Lord. He basically exists, at least at the point when we meet him, as this combined entity of him and a serpent god that his main goal appears to be removing the greater will from its hold on the Lands Between and possibly establishing a new order, a more snakely one. And to do this, he's prepared to devour even his most strongest of followers in order to basically power himself and by extension the serpent up to the point where they're actually able to devour the gods like they want to so bad. And I do sometimes wonder if Rykard here was the first god that the god-devouring serpent ate, and I would think presumably no. Maybe it's eaten some god from a previous cycle or something to that effect. But Rykard, though, he bared a shard of the Elden Ring itself, a great rune, which he also fed to the serpent when he took a dive in the Snake Lake. And I would have to assume this greatly empowered Iglay. And maybe that's why the Golden Order turned him into public enemy number 1. I mean, sure, it could be for any of the litany of crimes he's committed, but I think the most egregious of all was that, feeding a piece of the Elden Ring to an eldritch, god-devouring serpent. Honestly, it's no wonder the Godskin apostles have thrown in their lot with him. He essentially severed himself from the greater will in a manner not unlike his sister Ranni, but just in a much more straightforward way, and I guess the only difference would be that Rykard was not an Empyrean, which was okay for him. I mean, he had no desire in succeeding the current goddess Marika as the number 1 eternal ruler of the lands between. He'd rather see it all burn. But it's not hard to see why Ranni came to her brother Rykard for assistance in stealing the Rune of Death from Malekith. I mean, say what you want about dear old Richard here, one thing he's not is close-minded. Assisting with that theft was right up his alley. I mean, he's nothing if not blasphemous, and there's nothing more blasphemous than conspiring against a goddess and helping your sister steal something from her half-brother, the god of death himself. Rykard, above all else, didn't give a fuck about the rules. His home soon became a serpent cult stronghold dedicated to a deity that directly opposed the current ruling ones. The walls became adorned with the crest of this serpent cult, which sort of looks like the opening maw of a snake with another snake inside it, or perhaps that's supposed to be its throat or its tongue. But to me it looks like a snake's mouth opening up wide with another snake inside it, and he's got this symbol all over his mansion. He also has what I believe to be the symbol of Iglay the Great Serpent itself. However, it's only found in 2 places, one at the Great Serpent's Temple, and the other one is visible on the Volcano Manor if you're approaching it from the Road of Iniquity. The symbol itself is just a triangle with a circle around it, but it seems to have at least some ties to this great snake. If it's not outright, it's legit symbol. You know, time is a flat circle and all that. Aside from just being a staging base for Rykard's war against the Erdtree, this was also a sanctified holy place for the Serpents. Volcano Manor was essentially the Snake's Vatican. But not only that, the mansion became a bastion of iniquity in every sense of the term. Albinorics are tortured and experimented on by their own fellows. Nobles are rounded up and imbued with poison in their heads. Peasants, though, they were the most disposable. They were either subject to mad science experiments or just simply dismembered and used for parts. Human women like Raya's birth mother Daedakar were brought in and subject to strange birthing rituals which produced these man-serpent-like children that would soon become the main garrison of Rykard's castle. And the man-serpents had a unique physiology. They had little skinny arms and legs, but their main torso and head was capable of going full extendo neck, super long, and then shrinking back down sort of like a slinky. But like many of the creatures that were created via the assistance of some sort of outside god like the Kindred of Rot or the Beastmen, they possessed a keen level of craftsmanship. In this case, though, the material they worked with was magma. They would make whole weapons out of literal magma. Most impressively with the magma sword and the magma candle whip. The whip in particular is used by one of the more unique snake men you'll come across in Volcano Manor. This one appears to have taken a big gulp of magma and is, able to spit it out at you while also waving his whip and spraying magma everywhere. But he's only marginally unique. Now these serpent men are also capable of using magic as well. In fact, their current religious leader, at least that's what I believe he is, the current snake pope, is a sorcerer, showing the blend of intelligence and faith, that the snakes use to practice their sorcery. This guy must be really important because he kind of guards the only other way to Rykard besides the one that the old Madam's family is guarding. So this big-headed snake has presumably been charged with leading the snake cult while, ever since Rykard became one with the serpent. I mean, he definitely seems important. He's guarded by like 3 snake men and being worshipped by some of those exploding poison head villagers. Or nobles, excuse me. It's also worth noting that this unique serpent is the only place in the game where you can get the Mount Gelmir staff, a fittingly forked staff that boosts lava sorceries. But funny enough, the most exalted looking man-serpent and the only one with the staff doesn't know any lava sorceries, or if he does, he doesn't use them. He mostly just opts to use Glintstone Pebble, but occasionally he'll use a slightly bigger Glintstone spell. I think it's Comet, or it could just be Glintstone Shard or something. I'm bad with sorceries. I don't know though, it always seemed like a missed opportunity to not have him using these extravagant magma sorceries that we never really get to see used by any other characters. One thing's for sure though, that Gelmir's staff should have definitely been on that list of hard to get items video I made. But anyway, the funniest thing about this chief sorcerer slash priest snake isn't his cool red cape, which unfortunately isn't available. It's that big bulbous head of his. I mean, at first I thought he had to be just a snake who had eaten very, very recently and hasn't digested his meal yet. But according to cut content, that's actually like an egg helmet thing that you used to be able to get from the game before they cut it out. And I mean, I get it. I see the resemblance between that and the Serpents Amian thing that we find in the Temple of Igle that Raya was born from. But I do think it's kind of odd that he's still wearing it on his head and he's in this power of, prestige and exaltation within the serpent cult, and he's still wearing his a piece of his birth mother. I mean, maybe that's, one of the little quirks of their culture. Like in Dragon Age, there's the Qunari who are all horned except for a few who are non-horned, and those ones who aren't horned are believed to be destined for greatness. I mean, honestly, when I first saw him, I thought it had to either be full of magma or perhaps poison, like that whip-wielding one with the silver armor. But that doesn't appear to be the case either, because he doesn't spit any of it on you. He, in fact, uses his head as a bludgeoning weapon and tries to smash you with it. And this absolute genius appears to be being worshipped by the indoctrinated nobles that Rykard had kidnapped and imbued with poison for reasons I still can't seem to divine. They're probably just hostages who got Stockholm Syndrome, though, and then they started worshipping a snake, and then their brains turned to poison. It really does bum me out that we can't get his cape. Now, aside from the average garden variety snake men who all wield burnt out magma weapons, or the serpent god cleaver, and the old egg-headed pope here, there's one other seemingly important snake. Specifically the poison-spewing one with the candle whip that I mentioned earlier, who is supposedly in charge of conducting rituals. Now this snake must be pretty special, possibly the second highest ranked serpent man here after the caped fucker. It's wearing these ornate silver jewels on its head and this coiled snake bracelet thing on each of its legs. Plus this one happens to be the only one who's in possession of a functional magma whip, similar to how the Gelmir staff is only in possession of the high priestess slash pope. Even though this bejeweled serpent doesn't actually drop its whip like the sorcerer does with the staff. And I think there's possibly some significance to the jewels all being silver, considering the fact that Rykard employs a handful of albinorics. Plus, silver itself was also said to be blasphemous to the Erd Tree, considering it birthed all those horrifying homunculus, the albinorics who I just mentioned, and the silver tears, and eventually the mimic tears. Basically, the Erd Tree hates silver almost as much as it hates snakes, and it has a lot to do with the Nox people. So that alone could be the reason that this high-ranking serpent is wearing all this silver jewelry. But the snake men, they enjoy long baths in the lava like our dear friend Alexander, possibly to temper their hides, which, fun facts, is also what they do to those copper shields they carry around to temper them. Oh yeah, unsurprisingly, serpent men also possess a powerful poison, so don't get bit. Because unless you got an antidote handy, then you're going to be stuck with that poison for quite a bit. It has a really slow decreasing meter. This tactic is mimicked by wielders of the coil shield with a deadly efficiency. The man-serpents are nothing if not a clever and cunning bunch. I mean, they are followers of Rykard after all. And their presence within Volcano Manor, as well as the prison town and the Temple of Igle, appears to have been kept secret from the majority of the tarnished members of the Volcano Manor Fellowship. Or at the very least, it's just kept secret from Raya. I mean, I imagine Bernal knows about the snakes and the purpose of Rykard's manor. The others, including Patches, are probably aware of it too. It just seems like they're all complicit in keeping the secret from Raya. Which again is probably for the girl's own good. I mean, look what happens when she finds out the truth. But she's another one who deserves her own video. We'll talk about her at a later date. Let's get back to Rykard. The noble yet blasphemous one who believed the Tarnished and the Shardbearers got a pretty raw deal from America, and by extension the Greater Will, so he said fuck them and went to war. He essentially made himself into a devil. He had a castle full of extendo-necked snake men. Some of them actually, or at least one, has this engorged head, which looks hilarious. Now, it's generally believed that Rykard brought these snake men back into the world through some strange ritual that involved the serpent god Igle, a woman named Daedakar, and Rykard himself. This is speculation, of course, but it seems to be the implication. But I'll probably go into a deeper dive of the snake men as a whole on a video I plan to do about Raya. And again, I do think that the snake men as a race do predate Rykard, but but I don't think there were very many, if at all any, left when Rykard first set foot in Mount Gelmir. And I believe it's even implied somewhere with a description, something to the effect of, not long after a certain demigod fed himself to the great serpent, the serpent men followed, like soon after. It's also worth noting that Raya, or Zarias, well, she's a bit different than the common variety of the snake men we see at Volcano Manor, as according to her, she's not accepted by serpents or men. So that leads me to believe that whatever ritual was committed with Datakar was different than whatever birthing rituals were used to create the average snake men. Perhaps Rykard was attempting to create a true hybrid between humans and snakes, and this was the result. But unfortunately for Raya, both of the races that she's a part of will shun her upon learning what she is. Truly a tragic story for one of Elden Ring's nicest characters. It's also one of the better moral choices in the game when it comes to these quest lines. But the Serpent Men, in my opinion, are a bit similar to beings like the Kindred of Rot or the Beast Men, in that they're able to craft amazingly effective and beautiful weapons despite being supposed, these sort of abomination-like beings. And it's exactly because of that they're able to craft these unique and cool-ass weapons and come up with these, well, for lack of a better term, inhuman designs. Anyway, though, let's talk about this mysterious serpent god of Mount Gelmir, Aigle. So at some point, Rykard, in his travels, discovered the old religion that was dedicated to this god, along with various hexes from the volcano that he sort of modernized into normal sorceries. But Praetor Rykard would eventually encounter the literal snake god himself, Aigle, and eventually feed himself to the eldritch being, turning them into what they are today. It seems pretty easy for Rykard to assume dominance of the snake. But that being said, this seemed to be the breaking point for many of his knights, as they either abandoned him or, well, became snake food. So it appears Aigle has been around for a while and is now more powerful than ever, with Rykard having sort of melded with him. So this great serpent appears to be similar to a certain serpent we've met in the past in Dark Souls 1, Koth, who was responsible for teaching the dark race the art of life drain. Now that's important because Aigle has several artifacts that are associated with him, and all of them possess the ability to drain life. The Serpent God's Cleaver, the Blasphemous Scepter, even Rykard's own sword would become a living embodiment of the Great Serpent's power. And Aigle is one of the only things in the Elden Ring universe that is associated with this type of magic. This red aura life drain magic that is very similar to the life drain of Dark Souls 1, except there's no humanity involved. Although, just to be clear, I do think that this connection is simply just a nice little callback, and there's no actual lore connection between Aigle and Koth. So the worship of Aigle was considered to be heretical. And I guess it's not hard to see why. I mean, he's this cult-aligned giant serpent that lives in a volcano filled with lava. But judging by his religious artifacts, I'd say that Aigle still managed to find his fair share of worshippers. Unsurprisingly, one such group of these faithful are the Godskin apostles and nobles, beings that would eventually adapt inhuman physiologies, not unlike the snakes themselves, especially the Godskin apostles, who have similar stretching out moves and abilities. The nobles, on the other hand, were the most ancient of the apostles, and they possess a giant tail, can bloat themselves up. Yeah, you guys are all familiar with these bosses. So how about some background info on these dapper gentlemen? They were raised by an Empyrean referred to as the Dusk-Eyed Queen, who herself possessed the god-killing powers of a black flame, which she would pass on to her adoptive children, the Godskins. She would essentially raise them up to go to war with the ruling class of gods at the time, presumably Marika and her ilk, and they were extremely good at what they did, hunting and skinning the gods. They were quite prolific in this act. Well, up until they were inevitably defeated by Malekith, the Black Blade of Marika herself, and the Eternal Goddess would cripple the power of the Dusk-Eyed Queen and her children by removing the Rune of Destined Death from the Golden Order, completely neutering the god-killing power of the Black Flame. This would inevitably result in most of the surviving apostles and nobles going into hiding, but that doesn't necessarily mean they stopped practicing their hobbies. One found himself the subject of worship in a windmill village. Another found himself either guarding or hunting Ranni's carcass, but also for good measure. It appears Malekith enslaved two of the Godskins, one noble and one apostle, to act as guardians of this floating temple that was Malekith's domain. And speaking of this priest dog, We also know that Rykard was responsible for assisting Ranni in stealing a piece of the Rune of Death from Malekith so she could pull off her grand scheme, and in return, Rykard was given these traces that allowed him to parry Malekith if he ever had to come to blows with the god of death himself. That's one thing I've always liked about Rykard. He's the only demigod who didn't fear Malekith. And it appears that the surviving remnants of the Godskin hunt, or at least some of them, have aligned their interests with Rykard's. It's not hard to see why a group that refers to themselves as the Godskin Hunters would ally themselves with something that refers to itself as the god-devouring serpent. Now, I always wonder what god that it was that it devoured. Perhaps it's just referring to Rykard, who wasn't really a god, he was just a demigod. Presumably that snake ate an actual god at some point, but the jury's still out on that one. It's worth noting, though, that the Godskin apostles, they have that sort of helix corkscrew-like blade on their Godskin peeler. That itself is a somewhat serpentine design, in my opinion. And this sort of coiled design could also be found on the crest of that new demigod character we were just introduced to, Mesmer, so perhaps he has some association with the Godskin apostles, or at the very least the Dusk-Eyed Queen as well. We already know he has something to do with the snakes, as well as his obvious affiliation with the Formless Mother. Which reminds me, since we're talking about serpents, there's a certain bow that is able to turn any arrow into a poison arrow through quote-unquote pagan magic, but these bows were crafted and used by a group of assassins that were called the Formless Serpents. They also made unique arrows as well, but at the very least, this is evidence of a connection between the Formless Mother and the god-devouring serpent. And besides the serpent men, the only other serpents you'll find in Rykard's castle besides the Great One is a bunch of snails that, upon closer inspection, are just snakes wearing shells. In fact, it actually seems like almost all of the different kinds of snail enemies we come across in the game are all actually serpents with shells on. Sure, they've got snail-like bodies, but you get what I mean. They've got the snail's eye stalks and obviously the snail, but everything else about them is entirely serpentine. They've got scales, forked tongues, they even make the same damn noise as a snake does. They also appear to be highly adaptable. I mean, ones who live in glintstone-filled areas become glintstone snails, and you can even find undead skeletal ones. The bone ones even drop these serpentine arrows I mentioned earlier that have associations with the Formless Mother. So perhaps their presence at so many of these ancient graveyards and battlefields indicates that the snakes were part of a war that was fought a long time ago. I think they might be the most common out of all these snail serpents. But the poison ones in question are only found in Volcano Manor, hidden inside its secret corridors. The only other place you could actually find these ones is in Nokron, the Eternal City, but those ones might just be imitation snail snakes. You know the Nox and their love of creating tears to imitate various different types of wildlife. Now there's one other type of snail snake, the spirit caller snail, who most people are familiar with, really occasionally annoying enemies. These ones in particular are the only ones to not have snail eyes, they've just got regular snake eyes. And one in particular found in the mountaintops of giants happens to drop the Godskin's swaddling clothes, happens to possess the rather annoying ability to summon a spiritual version of the Godskin duo, which to me seems to be hinting at some sort of possible connection between the Godskins and the Dusk-Eyed Queen, as well as the snakes and the Formless Mother, who already seem to possess some sort of innate connection. Perhaps Mesmer will be the missing link that ties all these different things together. Or perhaps not, perhaps he's just a blasphemous guy who liked to use blasphemous things. I'm not quite sure what my current theory on all of that is, but it is food for thought. Anyway though, back to the serpents. You gotta hand it to Rykard though, when he picks his theme he really sticks with it, magma and snakes. Even his twisted kidnapping devices, the abductor virgins, were adorned with golden snakes, while the figure itself cradles a silver baby. Now perhaps this is just showing a connection between the serpents, Rykard or Tanith, and the Albinorics that also work at Volcano Manor. Either way though, most abducted by the abductor virgins end up in one place, a torture chamber filled with lava. Which, speaking of magma, there is, in my opinion, a possible connection between the Dragon Communion School and the Great Serpent. First of all, the Great Serpent lives in a volcano filled with magma, and generally becomes more powerful based on everything that it eats. And the Dragon Communion is a church that revolves around the hunting of dragons and eating their hearts to gain their power. But if you decide to eat too many hearts, you go too off the rails with your dragon hunting, then you're turned into a magma worm. A pretty pathetic lizard with half-grown wings that sort of just lives in constant agony is able to manifest a wing-like magma sword as a weapon and sort of just is stuck like that for all eternity. And this is not limited to humans either. This can even happen to trolls who eat too many dragon hearts, as we saw with Theodrix, once a hero in the war with the giants, now just a pretty pathetic, massive magma worm. Presumably sleeping in the cold to help quell the pain of being constantly on fire. And we already know that the Great Serpent of Mount Gelmir was able to gain new abilities based on the stuff that it ate. And we also know that it changed considerably after eating something really powerful, so there is parallels there, plus there's the whole magma thing. And while I can't quite prove that connection, I do think that Mesmer's character is going to provide me with some more evidence. I mean, look at the guy, he's wearing the Drake Knight set, has Dragon Communion eyes, and has a little pet blood serpent. Anyway though, at the church devoted to this serpent Igle, you'll find a Godskin noble presumably guarding the shed skin of the Great Serpent. Now again, he could just be guarding it because he wants to make a sick outfit out of it, but I do think the presence of one of his henchmen, the Black Flame monks outside, sort of indicates that the Godskin noble was doing something along the lines of praying or, just worshipping in there. Again, this is all just speculation, just how I read the situation. Fun fact though about the Black Flame monks, they were just regular flame monks from the mountaintops, dudes who were charged with guarding the last fire giant and his fell god, but eventually over the generations as they passed sort of came to worshipping him. Long story short, some of them came down from their mountaintop in search of a thief that stole some of their secrets, and on the way some encountered the mighty Black Flame, probably wielded by a Godskin apostle or a noble. And they saw that this flame was even more powerful than the flame they worshipped, so they sort of switched sides and became Black Flame monks and wore white cloaks instead of red ones. They presumably chose white to look like their new leaders, the Godskin apostles and nobles. So whether or not the serpent-like Godskins are involved with Rykard's schemes or those of his patron deity Igle, the Volcano Manor faction as a whole effectively was just the tarnished wing of this ancient serpent cult. I mean, shit, it was specifically designed to essentially be a dark mirror image of the Round Table Hold for blasphemous Tarnished to go live. And again, the ultimate honor for these fucks is to just be eaten by Rykard and to become a member of the Great Serpent family, which is called becoming a champion, as Tanith puts it. Although at the end of the day, you're probably just turned into a burning rancor, or one of those writhing limbs or pieces of flesh that's coming off of the snake's back or off of Rykard's sword. That seems to be the alternative to becoming a rancor down in the snake's belly. Anyway though, with the addition of this new character Mesmer, we have a possible connection between the Formless Mother, the God-devouring serpent, and the Dragon Communion. Although I gotta admit, at the end of the day, these three might not be connected outside of the fact that Mesmer was just in pursuit of power and found power through all three of these different means. Personally, I think those three things are connected, but it could really go either way. And it's worth mentioning that, after you defeat Rykard, that the God-eating serpent and even part of Rykard aren't really completely dead. I assume that if they're going by the established rules of the snake, which are vague at best, that if Tanith is able to eat all of whatever is left of Rykard and the serpent, that they will live on within her and she will be powered up and might possibly ascend into some higher form of being because, she's consuming the remains of a powerful demigod and an eldritch serpent. But I guess an easy way to nip that in the bud would be to just kill Tanith there. But it always felt like there was more to her story, that it wasn't going to just end right there with her eating Rykard. And maybe it is just to show that the serpent will live on into whatever comes next. But who knows? Now I do have one observation more relating to the DLC trailer we saw yesterday. And it's basically, I now think that Miquella went with Mog willingly. I no longer think the Lord of Blood kidnapped him. I think whatever Mog did was actually all a part of Miquella's plan, and he actually just used Mog to, escape into the Shadowlands. I guess we'll eventually find out. But whatever it was in pursuit of power, and it was fueled by ambition, much like Rykard when he decided to feed himself to the god-devouring serpent, so he could supposedly gain the power he needed to adequately devour the gods and presumably create a new order. Rykard was already a highly ambitious dude with a strong sense of justice and, punishment for said justice. But when he found the snakes, he became ensnared when they showed him the real truths of the world, and, well, he changed considerably. He began kidnapping nobles, experimenting on them, turning people into snakes. He's sort of like a combination of Aldia and Seath from Dark Souls 1 and 2, in that he's just this mad scientist guy whose goals are ultimately noble, but just how he goes about them are horrifying. And those are always my favorite characters in the Dark Souls universe, especially Aldia and Rykard. But long story short, he was tempted by a snake. He sort of got this Luciferian quality about him. He fell from grace, he went to war with the gods. He's just an interesting figure who I'd welcome to learn anything more about. And at the end of the day, both Rykard and Iglay still live on within Tanith, provided you haven't killed her too, in a similar manner to how I believe Radahn and even the Fire Giant are able to live on within Alexander and eventually Jarbaron. Or at the very least, their warrior essence that made them does. But yeah, this video was just mainly to share some observations regarding our Serpentine brethren in Elden Ring. Anyway though, I hope you guys found this video at least somewhat informative and entertaining, and if you liked it, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on about various things, sometimes unsynced with audio and video, hopefully that'll never happen again though, then please consider subscribing. But I'll stop rambling so we can have our famous outro and then the final thoughts. So I do consider myself one of the premier Rykard defenders. His goals were noble, and he caused effectively less widespread death and destruction than Malenia did, who is still revered pretty favorably. Plus, and I only learned this recently, after committing his horrific acts of blasphemy, he offered Tanith a potion of forgetfulness so that she could forget all of the shit they did together and him as a whole, and she refused it, being the down woman that she is. A surprisingly good woman to have by your side. Tanith does, in fact, deserve a video, and I hope I can get to that somewhat soon, but there's a lot of stuff in the backlog right now. Maybe she'll get fast-tracked. I'm not sure yet. I hope so, though. Alright, so originally today I was going to release this Ordina video, but I didn't actually finish it because I decided to make this Serpent one instead. The Ordina one should come out tomorrow, though, and the Aldia one, like I always say, is coming soon, but it's definitely going to be one of the longer videos because he's such an all-encompassing character, and he's one of the most iconic, so you gotta get it done right and whatnot. But yeah, I've also got that Desolation of Malenia video coming, a Zant video, that drug trade one, a whole bunch of good stuff coming, all in varying stages of development, but I finally got a lot more time now to work on them, so they should all be coming soon. As always, though, I hope you guys be safe, and I will see you next time, which should be pretty soon. Anyways, though, see ya.